Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Performance Talk. My name is Yul Gordon. I'm here today, as always, with Chris Costa. Chris, how's everything going, man?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm busy, like everybody.
Yeah, I know we talked last week, and man, I really wasn't feeling sorry for you, but I was feeling sorry for you for a little bit.
Thanks, you. Appreciate you.
I mean, you sounded like somebody was chasing you with a knife. It was like, oh gosh. But we've all had those days and moments. So I know you'll handle it. I know you'll handle it and do well, as you always do.
Thanks. Appreciate that.
All right. Yeah, I had to throw something in there for you. Lighten up the mood. All right, man. So talk to us about our guest today.
So today, you're throwing it to me because you don't want to butcher his name. Is that what it is?
That's what we do.
Oh, that's a good one, yo. So today we have the innovator, creator, designer, idea front for Flow Bio, Stefan Van Der Fluit. Is that the right pronunciation of the last name?
Van Der Fluit, but
Oh,
yeah, I would,
okay.
it's a tough job getting that one right, so I forgive you. I've now defaulted to saying Van Der Fluit, which isn't how my parents intended it, but it's more internationally friendly.
Well, there we go. We got it. So Stefan Van Der Fluit, internationally friendly man. So you're relatively, I don't want to say new on the scene, but you might be new known to people. Tell our listeners, what is Flow Bio?
Yeah. So we're, the timing of this podcast is quite timely because we just launched 4 weeks ago. So we came out of stealth. And basically, what Flow Bio is, we're the creators behind the S1. So I don't know when this podcast goes live, but for those who know Flow Bio, the very few people in this world who do, would recall our old brand of the product called the Flow Patch. Now it's called the S1, but essentially we created the S1, and the S1 is the world's most accurate hydration sensor for cyclists, triathletes, and runners. And what we do is we measure in real time how much water and how much salt you're losing throughout your exercise session. And off the back of that, we create recommendations on what you need to drink, both in terms of how much water should be in your bottle and how much salt should be in that water bottle. To ensure that you maintain adequately hydrated throughout the work required. So yeah, on a very high level, it's a small wearable, which, come prepared. I have it literally in the other room, but I don't know. We might have time later, and I can kind of take you on a tour of the house and go get it. But yeah, it's a very tiny wearable, which basically clips on to a heart rate monitor. So I personally wear it on my chest. I have a Wahoo ticker. But other athletes who use like optical heart rate monitors, like the Polar OH1 Plus or the Wahoo ticker or whatnot, it's compatible with that too. And yeah, basically it's completely reusable, unlike other hydration sensors out there, which some people might be familiar with, like the GX patch by Gatorade or the Nix biosensor. Ours is completely reusable. So, you buy it once, you just look after it, make sure the battery's charged. Maintenance is super easy. You just rinse it under the sink, every couple of times, similar to like your Garmin chest strap where you wash the electrodes with dishwasher salt water or dishy soap water. So yeah, it's a pretty straightforward product. And the data, we've done some validation studies both internally, and now we're also doing it with the University of Rome and World Athletics. So they're funding the study to demonstrate the validity and accuracy of the system, which is, from our testing, we know it's competitive or basically as accurate as lab-based systems. So yeah, we're pretty proud and very excited to see what the market does with it.
So tell our audience of athletes who may not be endurance sport athletes or be familiar with sweat data or the importance of sweat data or hydration. Tell us about that a little bit. From just a field and court sport athlete, I'm told to hydrate, or we tell them to hydrate all the time, but that's it. Hey, you need to hydrate. Hey, you need to hydrate.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's the question of why should be answered. And what are you measuring? Give us the whole rundown of why this is important if we're not a cyclist or a triathlon or an ultra endurance sport athlete.
Yeah, so I'll take it back to first principle, just why we sweat, why the human body sweats. So, it's also one of the reasons why we are where we are compared to other species. Our ability to sweat allows us to essentially endure long, hard periods of work. And the reason for that is sweat is our body's way of maintaining core body temperature. So it's a thermoregulatory response. Sorry. So as soon as you start doing any exercise or any strenuous activity, your body temperature is going to warm up as a function of your heart rate increasing, right? And about 70% of energy produced is heat. So your body needs to get rid of that heat. Otherwise, it's going to overheat and die. So any individual active, either voluntarily through participating in sport or exercise or whatever, or involuntary through just their job, right? So soldiers or war fighters or construction workers or industrial, what we call the industrial athlete. For them, it's incredibly important to understand their sweat profile. Why? Sweat is a great thing. It allows us to do what we can do. Without sweat, marathons wouldn't be a thing. The Olympics wouldn't be a thing. Sky rises wouldn't be a thing because we wouldn't be able to build them. So it's a phenomenal mechanism that we've evolved or developed. The issue with sweat is the two main components of sweat are water and sodium, which are super important to our body's overall functioning, right? Take us back to like grade school biology, osmosis. When people think hydration, colloquially speaking, people think water, right? So the majority of people don't think salt, and that's already where you go wrong. Hydration is a balance. So that the scientific term means a balance between water and salt is good if you're hydrated. So already you're talking about two things, not one. So when people think I need to hydrate, immediately they think I need to drink water. Really, they need to drink water and salt, but we'll get onto that later. But anyways, hydration simply means you have a balance. Dehydration is an imbalance of those two ratios, right? So you can actually be overhydrated, which is a form of dehydration called hyponatremia. And this fun fact is actually what kills most people of dehydration. Because in the back of our mind, as you were just saying, you need to hydrate, you need to hydrate, you need to hydrate. So what happens is people just keep chugging water. And the issue with that is you dilute your sodium. So your cells, osmosis, are not able, they don't have this amount of salt in your system to absorb that water that you're ingesting. So what happens is you basically are diluting your sodium from your bloodstream. And then if things really go south, you die. What we typically think of dehydration is hypernatremia, where you have too little water in your system. So any individual who's active should understand what their body's essentially burning in terms of water and salt to be able to maintain that level of activity. So the thing with hydration is, we're not doping, right? Like we're not providing people with some legal doping. Like your body can only perform what you train it to perform. We're not going to give you, as a hydrated athlete, suddenly 20% more power or 20% more sprint speed, whatever. With proper hydration, you are able to sustain your output, your maximum output for longer periods of time, right? And that's really important because what you don't want to have over the course of a game or over the course of a race is your performance basically tapers down. That naturally is going to happen, but what you want to do is prolong that tapering effect as much as possible, which obviously is a combination of carbohydrate intake, right? The amount of proper grams per hour, but also the amount of water and salt intake. So yeah, I mean, any individual, be it, court athlete, field athlete, race drivers, right? We were speaking to way back, this was 4 years ago, the former head of human performance at Red Bull Racing, the Formula One team. And he basically in conversation was like, look, our engineering team would happily spend tens of millions of dollars finding some form of aerodynamic gain and shave off 1/100th of a second per lap. Like happily throw tens of millions of dollars at that problem. I guarantee you, if Max Verstappen is properly hydrated, he's going to race a tighter race line. He'll get that 1/100th of a second. By purely being better hydrated, he'll have more cognitive performance, more attention, more focus. Because again, hydration also impacts your ability to focus and your cognitive performance because your brain is 70% water, right? So the second you start working, especially car drivers in Bahrain, where it's inhumanely hot atmospheric temperatures already, let alone they're in fireproof material, right? They lose an insane amount of water. The reason why they weigh in, weigh out, part of that is to understand how much water they lost during the race, and sometimes it can be north of like 7 liters, which is insane. Put in perspective, I'm around 70 kilos. If I lose 7 liters, that's 10% body mass gone in water, which is crazy dangerous. So yeah, anyone leading an active life really should care about their sodium and fluid requirements. But some people just get lucky, right? So we've seen it in the data around 35% of the population have a low sweat rate and low sweat sodium concentration. So they just get away with it. They get away with a poor hydration strategy just because their body actually doesn't lose that much sodium, that much water. But for the 65% of us, it's actually quite important to understand your body's unique requirements. And the issue with just how our bodies function and the complexity of the human body, these things fluctuate. And they fluctuate as a function of like temperature, intensity, duration of exercise, humidity, elevation, time of the year. So the body adapts in the hotter seasons to basically get more efficient at dissipating heat. So your sweat rate increases, but your sodium concentration decreases because your body gets more efficient at reabsorbing sodium, which is a great mechanism. And in the winter or colder months, the inverse is true. Basically, your body doesn't lose as much water because it doesn't have to. It's not as warm, but then you start losing a lot more sodium because it loses that adaptation. So this is something which is actually more and more important for athletes training in the heat and racing or competing in the heat. You need to acclimate your body to the heat. So for people, yourself, you're in Texas, right? Folks in Texas, the athletes at all the NCAA kind of programs, they're training outside. So they're acclimated. But if you have a team traveling in where the temperature for them is, I'm from Europe, right? So like say 20 Celsius, I used to live in Texas where it hits north of 35, right? If you're traveling in from a place where locally, like you're used to 20 and you have to compete at 35 Celsius with the humidity, you're absolutely screwed if you don't heat acclimate. And the beauty of the device that we've developed is we can also tell an athlete when their body's acclimated or adapted to the heat that they need to compete in. Because we can show that response. We can show the sweat rate going up and the sodium going down. So there's a whole host of sports science that's unlocked through having this kind of measurement system. But yeah, long story short, it's super, super important because if you want to exercise properly and if you want to maintain your peak performance, hydration's one of the critical pillars to be able to do that.
Yeah, agreed. Generally, the biggest issue that we see is change in blood viscosity, which then affects pressure and flow. Right. Pressure and flow are affected. Now we have a resistance issue. So essentially our liquid tissues aren't getting where they need to go to either deliver or evacuate problems to keep it as simple as possible.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if your blood gets thicker because there's less water in it, your heart's working harder. So the rate of perceived exercise goes up. Your muscle glycogen gets depleted quicker because you're having to burn more carbohydrate. So, I don't know about team sports, but I'm a cyclist. I switched from triathlon to bike racing. Like for me, if I'm depleting my muscle glycogen level, I only have 2,000 calories worth of muscle glycogen, right? Like I do not want to be tapping into those systems unless I absolutely have to. And the last thing I want to do is tap into them unnecessarily by just not having enough water in my system and salt in my system to absorb that water. So yeah, it's the body needs water. I mean, what is it? Like you can survive 14 days without food, only 2 days without water. There's a reason for that.
Yeah, totally. So with Flow Bio, right, what was it that you saw that was missing in current product lines or in current lines of thought that led you to say, okay, I can come up with a product that can do something better or be more efficient or will actually answer a problem?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the best problems are solved by people who experience them. And I myself am a classic example of that kind of founder story. So I started doing triathlon in I'm just trying to remember, I think it was 2015. Got quite competitive around 2018 when I quit Facebook. So I had some time. There was a period I was actually considering going professional. So I got a coach after coming in first place for the Dutch National Championship for my age group. Because I was like, well, I did that uncoached. I'd love to see where I could go with a coach who's actually developing a plan around me and around my physiology. That's when I kind of came across hydration. So I couldn't hack it going pro. Basically, I felt constantly hungover and just lethargic, the worst headaches ever. And I was like, what the heck is going on? So I had a conversation with my coach, who was a former Olympic athlete. So his whole life he spent competing and training at top level. So for him, the first thing he was like saying was, well, what are you drinking? And I'm like, what do you mean? I drink water. He's like, yeah, but what's in your water? This was me 4 years into triathlon that I discovered electrolytes. Before then, literally, I never touched electrolytes. Why? Because as a child, all of us are told never add sodium to your diet. It's bad. Salt is bad. Blood
Right.
pressure, all that shit. Well, if you're an athlete, you need salt and you need a lot of it. And we have the data to show that. Like I, for example, in probably a really hard hour workout, already lose half of my daily sodium requirement just in an hour. So if you're an active individual, you need salt. You need to ignore your doctor's advice because that's one size fits all. The
Even if you're
doctor's
not,
advice is not.
if you
Yeah.
are a living organism, you require sodium. It's essential.
Yeah, I think what doctors typically say is there's additional sodium in our diet more than there should be, which is like fair. But
Sure.
at the same time, if you're losing 3-4 grams of salt in exercise, your diet's not going to cut it.
That's the
And I experienced that, so I was like, what the heck? So, and I should have known this because when I grew up in California, hence the US accent for a Dutch guy, I was going home. There's a period of 2 years or so where I was going home 2 to 3 days a week during the summer months, throwing up, headache, lethargic, dizzy, heat stroke.
yeah.
It took 2 years for my doctors to figure out that I was just not drinking enough. So I already knew I have a higher sweat rate than average. So obviously I should have applied that into my thinking when I started going pro. But anywho, by the by, that's when I discovered electrolytes and, more importantly, sport nutrition. Now I suffered from eating disorder as well. So for me, like, nutrition has always been a bit of an Achilles heel. But I decided, if I'm going to give this a shot, I really have to delve into this because food is fuel at the end of the day if you're an athlete, and that's all it is. And through this process of my coach exposing me to electrolytes, I just delved hardcore into the world of sports science to the point where I almost thought of going back to university to go study the subject. But yeah, basically, my co-founder and I, when we met, his background is in miniaturized electronic devices, and he loves understanding the human body and taking inspiration from nature's designs and converting that into physical engineering designs. So a great example of how Giovanni's done that, right? All the other companies in the world, apart from a couple, are looking at understanding the body through needles, right? Because they want to quantify blood. Giovanni's thesis has always been, why would we create an extra needle when the human body has a perfectly built-in needle, the sweat gland? We just need to take advantage and manipulate the behavior of the sweat gland, but instead of create a needle, take advantage of nature's built-in needles. So that's a bit of like Giovanni's genius. Where I came to the table was, I want to create something in human performance. I really don't want to do something in enterprise software because my whole career was spent in enterprise software, and I kind of had it. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life, closing deals at 10 p.m. at customer meetings, selling products which no one really cared about. So I was like, I want to do something consumer. I want to combine my passion for performance, and I want to do something wearable because there's something beautiful in understanding the human body, and there's like a personal belief from a consumer that if it's physically touching my body, it's inherently more accurate or inherently better, which in most cases it is. So yeah, it's basically, we started looking at what are other people doing. So we actually spoke with Nix, for example, from Meredith ages ago, trying to assess and understand where they were. So we spoke to a bunch of our to-be competitors at the time because we hadn't started the company yet, just to understand the lay of the land. We understand that good Gatorade was doing something, but it was a single use, like you had to take a photo, and it's just like, if anyone knows any athletes don't have time for that shit. So we started to understand the gaps from a user experience standpoint, which then obviously exposed the challenges from a tech standpoint, right? Because typically where the gaps are from UX is because the tech was just too difficult to accomplish, so you had to find shortcuts or ways around it. But Gio and I always had the thesis, like, if you do the hard stuff, the rest is easy. So we really set out, this has to be done right. It has to be incredibly accurate. It has to be really intuitive to use. And we decided no one else is really doing it right. And, that old saying, if you want it done right, do it yourself kind of thing. So we decided to essentially build Flow Bio. And 4 years later, 8 people in, we've come through 3 different technical iterations, 2 of which, so the previous 2 generations of our technology, were similar to the likes of Nix and Gatorade and Epicor, which are the 3 other main players in the space, which was all the single-use architecture, because we didn't think it was actually possible to make a reusable wearable, quantifying sweat because of issues with biofouling, sweat depositing on the surface of the sensor, it then messing up data for future sessions, sweat getting stuck in the channels, not being able to get it out. So part of the genius of the engineering team, what they managed to accomplish is the kind of bypassing of those challenges through, engineering, So geometry of the channel, the microfluidic channels that we're using, the sensor that we're using. And yeah, as a result of that, we now feel we have what was that kind of missing piece, which was a really good user experience with the high quality data. So yeah. Long story short, if you
Okay.
want it done right, do it yourself.
Yeah, that makes sense. Why do you think that there is a lack of representation in this sector of hydration? I mean, you mentioned there are 4 companies, including you, but that's limited by comparison when we talk about other performance faculties that are out there. Even something like force plates, there are more than 4 force plate companies out there, right? And everybody knows who they are. Most of those companies that you mentioned, you and I have been in the
No one
industry,
knows.
right? I mean, you don't hear of them. You hear about the hydration products, the electrolyte supplements, right? Because they advertise, but there are several that you don't hear of as well. And especially with governance and regulation, the ones that are available in the UK aren't generally available in the United States because the UK ones have more sodium, which makes more sense. And the products that we get are very low in sodium and probably don't help much at all, with the exception of the people that are already maintaining natriuretic content in the blood.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. Like we always joked, like if Gatorade actually wanted to create a better hydration solution, they should never have built the sweat sensor. They should actually just change the formulation of their core product line. Because if you look at the core content of sodium in Gatorade, it's sugar water. It is so useless to performance. It's not even funny.
They should
Which,
have
you know,
went back to their old product, which
well, I mean,
you
so
knew had
Gatorade,
salt in
right? Yeah, well, yeah, because so you know, and I studied Gatorade. I think Gatorade is a phenomenal founder origin story, right? It literally was created in a lab at the university right next to the football team, and this professor was like, "I have this crazy idea. These athletes are, you know, I can clearly see that they're fatigued. They're because they just weren't performing." And it's because they're in Florida where the heat is crazy, right? So he's like, okay, I have this crazy idea. Throw salt. I'm going to create a specific salt. The first one tasted horrendous, so they like played with the formulation, added a bit more sugar. But regardless, that team then went to become a winning team, right? So it's like obviously that product did what it needed to do, and then you know they took a turn. So we always joke that you know if Gatorade really was serious about this, rather than some marketing PR stunt, which eventually even failed because the product just failed, and they invested millions into this program. And that kind of answers your first question: why are there not many? It's really hard. There were a lot. Like so, there was one that went bankrupt called Ecrine. There's another company called Sweaty that's been taking 10 plus years. There was another company called Cora, which I think rebranded here in London. So there's been at least like 8 or 9 companies in the history of sweat. Sweat is also one of the newest bodily fluids of scientific interest, right? So it's one of the new kids on the block when it comes to bodily fluids of value. You know, up there like saliva, and it's kind of tears, like eye tears and sweat are similarly young when it comes to the scientific community thinking that there's actually value in there. But in terms of the larger companies pursuing sweat, it's the simple reason that it doesn't fit their architecture, right? None of these devices, not the Garmin's or Apple Watches or Polars or Suntos, et cetera, none of them have inlets, and none of them, and at the time, you know, we've now proven that you can, but at the time, none of them had architectures which had a consumable, reusable architecture to them. And this, like, you know, this is the question we get from investors all the time. Why wouldn't Apple do this? And it's like, well, Apple literally couldn't give a shit. Like our initial market is 10 million athletes. Apple like doesn't get out of bed for 10 million people. Apple only does something if it really is addressable to like 100 million plus consumers. And if it isn't, let someone else do it.
Yeah, but if they want to add your tech to their Apple Watch, you might be in a buyout mode.
Well, I mean, and then we'll talk. I mean, we're already able to entertain conversations with Apple in a different way because half of the product that we've developed, the value is mainly in software for that half. So from that perspective, we can license that to any company right now. And we are looking at that now in conversation with a couple. So like for us, the larger corporates just aren't looking at it because the market is too small and they're more interested in optical sensing because that's their current architecture for quantifying the human body. But, you know, like with the recent thing of pulse ox, I mean, we have a long way to go with optical sensing to do biomolecular data, let alone what it's already supposed to do. And we're not even going to talk about different skin colors, right? The optical sensing goes complete AWOL the second it's not on a white male individual. Because the training data just isn't diverse, right? So it's one of those things where it will take them time to quantify what we're quantifying, and they can't theoretically quantify what we're quantifying strictly because we're quantifying losses, and unless you actually are physically measuring and capturing that sweat, you just can't get that data.
Right.
But yeah, I think it's not interesting enough yet for the large companies is the long story. And the reason why there's not a huge ecosystem of smaller companies, it's multitude of factors. One, it's novel technology, which investors hate, right? Investors hate investing in science projects. So there's typically a gap of funding available to companies like ours, because investors want to see, they hate hardware, really don't like hardware. They don't like consumer, they'd rather have medical, but then you're talking about like 5+ year timelines because you have to get the whole FDA approval, et cetera. So there's just a massive void of funding to actually get this kind of technology off the ground. Which typically kills most companies because cash is king. So yeah, it's been in this really weird state of, it's a very young bodily fluid. It's not been heavily researched compared to blood or interstitial fluid. So there's a high technology risk, which investors just don't like, which then leads to a lack of innovation because there's no funding to basically finance that innovation.
You mentioned a couple other issues too, I think, that are important to kind of look at, not to say that they're deciding factors, but obviously the medical world, as we talked about briefly earlier, has a huge say in what we should be consuming, right? Even though there's a relatively limited amount of education that goes into human nutrition, they're in many ways the go-to for most people. Now, you get into the elite athlete population, and that's seriously not the case. Sports nutritionists or dietitians become far more important and are given the right to answer those questions, as they should be. I think the other piece too that we see with electronic devices is the damage that sodium does to those electronic devices.
Yeah.
Right. So we see that happening in ellipticals and in treadmills all the time for heart rate sensors. Right. Gym that gets used all the time. People are on those treadmills all the time, and boom, those sensors fell out because high concentration of sodium some way it makes its way into the hardware and shorts out the product or causes corrosion of some sort, right? There are those other pieces that kind of, I think, probably slide under the radar, but are also maybe some strangleholds. And I think I truly think that the idea that sodium is the enemy is one of the primary problems that we have. I mean, I tell every single.
It is, and it's also
not the enemy.
It's a marketing problem too, right? So for us, it's going to be a problem. Well, for us, it's not a problem because we don't care. And this sounds so bad, but we're not interested in the general consumer, in the person who goes to the gym 1 or 2 times a week, because to us, that's just not a market you should really care about. Simply because the CAC and LTV relationship just don't add up. But the issue with sodium in that market as well is people just aren't educated enough to, and I'm not saying it in a derogatory way. I'm just saying people don't know that it's important.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the endurance athlete space, we've been consuming electrolytes for decades. Like there's crazy amounts of sports supplement brands, like Science and Sport, Precision Hydration, OTE, Scratch, Noon, LMNT.
Right.
All these brands have basically spent years laying essentially up for us the market, right? Because for us, what we're doing is we're telling you how much electrolyte you're losing. And then these guys are the actual solution because we're not creating electrolytes. So there's a natural synergy here, which is something we're taking advantage of with all of them, which is how can we essentially help you sell more electrolyte and actually have your product be dosaged and used the way it was scientifically intended to be. Because what we've seen from our data, people don't consume enough electrolytes, period. We're still in this mindset where you take less than more out of caution or financial reasons, to be fair as well, because these things aren't per se cheap.
Right.
But now if you suddenly if you're bothered about performance and you suddenly have a device which is telling you lost 3 grams of salt, so if you don't take 3 grams of salt, like you won't recover adequately. Tomorrow's sessions won't be performed as best as they could, and you're going to build up chronic fatigue. So you have to take those 3 grams of salt. Now, who benefits from that? The electrolyte industry, right?
Right.
Because previously that athlete probably would have taken 500 milligrams of sodium, right? Because that's like typically the dosaging of most of these products.
Yeah.
So
Between 400 and
I think
500.
from our standpoint, yeah. So from our standpoint, it's like we want to make sure that people are properly using these supplements, and also ensure that individuals who really are focused about performance are able to fill that gap. Because right now it's literally finger in the air. People are looking at their clothing, so they wear black clothing to see like how much salt residue is deposited on the surface of their clothing. They're looking at like the beading of sweat, how much water is dissipating off of their skin surface. Like it's thirst response, which is typically a delayed response, especially as you get older.
Yeah.
It's severely delayed. Yeah. So typically by the time you have a thirst response, you're somewhat dehydrated already.
Yeah.
And then, in colder temperatures, so this is where I'm quite excited about it. So one of the things that we managed to innovate on as well is the dead volume. So typically you don't start to sweat until like 7 to 10 minutes onset of exercise, because that's kind of what it takes for the body to warm up enough for the body to say, okay, I now need to start dissipating some of this heat.
Right.
Most sensor companies in cold temperatures, they just won't capture sweat because they need so much more contents of water for their sensors to start to work. With us, we have basically a droplet of sweat is sufficient for us to measure. So we get sweat in our channel basically at onset of sweating, which means we're also quantifying when it matters most, which is from the start of sweating. And most companies, they miss out potentially the first like 20, 30 minutes, or they don't get it all in colder temperatures. And for us, we're fine in colder temperatures. Like I went on a bike today at like 8 Celsius and I got data. So that's also one of those things where in the cold, a lot of people, like I don't drink if it's cold.
Right.
Like my body, I don't know what the physiological reason is, but when it's cold, I'm not thirsty at all.
Well, your body releases angiotensin and ADH to help you retain fluid so that you can actually retain blood viscosity to keep that blood moving and also keep your core warm. So if you have a cool system, hormones kick in, then those two hormones are going to help to self-regulate that, right?
Yeah.
And because of the outside temperature, the ambient temperature around you affecting your skin, you now have condensation occurring as opposed to evaporation, right? Because it's that air, even if you have a barrier there, is still coming across your skin and picking up some of that heat and pulling it off, right? Negative feedback loops. That's really all we are. We're a giant negative feedback loop that functions in intricate little ways across a bunch of systems. So yeah, maybe you have really great controlled releases of angiotensin and ADH or aldosterone, and you can control your hydration levels internally without much ingestion. I'm a lot like you in the cold too. I don't consume a lot of water, and I find that I'm obviously more dehydrated. I think there's an ambient piece to that too. We have the heat on. Heat is generally artificial, right? So unless we're getting it from fire or we're getting it as moist heat in the old radiator systems that basically no longer exist in homes anymore, we have this forced dry air that's coming in. The whole ambiance around us is dry. Where's the water going to go? Out.
Yeah.
It wants to go where it isn't to fill the voids, right? So it's going to be pulling that water out of us to try to increase the humidity while we're trying to retain it. So we said we aren't as efficient unless we're highly trained in that space, right? So that's the other piece too. Fitness really has it based on how we sweat, how quickly we sweat, where we sweat, right? It's very common for us to sweat at the lower back region. Super common. It's like a hot spot for sweat glands, interestingly. The shin's another one. Sometimes people will sweat, in the forearm quite a bit versus other parts. So
it's quite,
so
there's different equations as well. So that's part of the trick as well, is you have to figure out, because you can wear the device anywhere, but your body doesn't uniformly have the same sodium concentration across the sites. So there's a linear regression model that you need to apply. But exactly, we've seen like the forehead is a hot spot.
That's another one. Yep.
And then it's very fascinating. But okay, there you go. That kind of answers my question. But so today, for example, it was like around 8-9 Celsius. It was raining, so the feels like temperature was significantly lower. But still, I lost 600 milliliters per hour, which was my sweat rate. I didn't touch my bottle for a good 45 minutes.
Right.
And the thing is, the reason why they're like, well, you have a sweat sensor, why aren't you using that? Because we haven't enabled real time yet. So we are getting it and sampling in every, I think 5 seconds is the sample rate. But we need to work with like the likes of Wahoo and Garmin, et cetera, with the Connect ecosystem to actually create those data fields still. So that's coming. But when that comes, then I'll have a physical reminder on my bike computer, basically saying, okay, you're ticking north. And I'll be like, oh yeah, well, I've lost on the bike computer 300 mils. I've not touched my bottle yet. I should quickly drink, 100 to 200 right now, just to make sure that I'm not compounding loss of water. So it's also that it's where you kind of you can see these things and then you can act in the moment. I think that'll be super magical, which for me will be quite beneficial in cold temperatures because I just don't by default really drink, even though I do still obviously need to.
Yeah.
So all these things we're talking about, and I'm looking kind of forward, and I'm looking at okay, so we got the Super Bowl coming up in 24 hours over here, right?
Yeah.
So my thought process is this: how do I get those big guys that weigh north of 300 pounds to start to become interested in something like this when they operate in either in a training scenario or a competition scenario in all kind of weather, under all kind of conditions? How do I convince them that this is an important wearable to put on? Maybe your forearm, maybe your thigh. I don't know, and it's going to help you because then I can measure this. And then how do I get the folks in those institutions, whatever sport it is, really, those institutions to say, okay, this is important because I see it. If I have a big lineman out there and he seems to be over 2 or 3 games, he's dropping off in the second, third quarter, and we got something going on and he's coming off the field and he's sweating like a madman. I'm losing data right there. Could there be something? I'm throwing all this out there for the rest of our audience that may not be in tune with endurance sports requirements and what they need to measure, how those things can be measured and useful either in a training scenario or a competition scenario, even for other court and sport athletes.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're actively having these conversations, for example, like the 49ers, Miami Heat, and like one of our partners, they work with the New York Yankees. So there already are some teams, and it comes down to the practitioner who's in charge for sport nutrition and performance.
Right.
For the most part, it really is that simple. It's whether the team has someone who believes this is important or not is a big requirement for us, because we unfortunately just don't have all the resource right now to go and we're not going to convert a Catholic to a Protestant. That's not our job.
Right.
So if we're going to go to a team, the person responsible for nutrition already has to be a believer that hydration matters. And for them now, they're trying to figure out how much it matters and what to do about it. So I'd say that's the first answer is it's really dependent on kind of the individuals, how much they've also been diving into the research and keeping up to date with the latest research and studies.
I would hope that they're
sometimes.
I mean,
you would. I mean, you'd be surprised. Some of these teams, you'd be surprised. I'll just leave it at that. We all think that they're like top of the game, but there are some teams where you're just like, okay, we're educating you how this works, which is fine, but it's something we can't do at scale yet. So I think for our standpoint, it depends. Either the practitioner in charge believes it, or the athlete themselves is super keen. So I don't know the guy, but Tom Brady, right? The reason he was able to compete to the age he competed is because he looked at every single marginal game and he cared, right? So you have some athletes like that, and you have some athletes who just go home, eat McDonald's, and play Xbox, and go to bed at like 12 at night and get up at 9 or whatever. So it's not a one size fits all. There's some athletes who really care, and we even had this in the pro team in the World Tour peloton, right? Cyclists, where typically cycling is like the early adopter of sports science, because you don't get through a Tour de France without really understanding how the body works and hacking it.
Right.
You just don't. So
Right.
cycling typically has always been the cutting edge of sports science and sport nutrition. And then it kind of trickles down into the rest of the sports. Team sports typically are like one of the last, because you basically have a team to dilute performance. If you're not performing, someone else might pick up for you. Whereas in individual sports, right? So like triathlon, running, athletics, they tend to come second after cycling. But yeah, if the individual is super switched on, then for us, typically that individual will use it. Their teammates will respect that individual, typically because they're like pretty like no BS kind of person who gravitates towards the marginal gains, and they respect that individual, and then they start to look at what that individual's doing and adopt that individual's approaches. So it's kind of the herd effect, right? Like all of us as
Yeah.
consumers, we're influenced by like marketing and what our favorite athletes are doing on Instagram. You have this, we're all people at the end of the day. You have that same human behavior taking place in the locker room. The herd effect is real in the locker room. If there's an athlete who's really respected, who's suddenly like, I don't know, using kinetic tape or kinesis tape, whatever that stuff was, suddenly everyone in the locker room's using it. They don't know why, they just are. And that's kind of also part of the strategy is identify those. Well, I come from a world in enterprise sales, right? So identify the sponsor, because the sponsor is basically going to make sure that everyone follows through. Keep them happy, keep them informed, do everything for them, and then the rest falls into place. But yeah, I think it's now more and more as a function of just global warming, everyone has to care about hydration. So I think it's also there's a timeliness to the situation in the product because the warmer months are getting significantly warmer, but the athletes still need to perform the same. Like they can't just, we can't just be like, oh, it's too hot, let's just go home and call it a day. No, you have to perform. You have to show up, you have to adapt. So they're looking at all these different ways to make sure the athletes adapt, and hydration is indeed one of those parameters that they're seriously looking at. I mean, the IOC is a great example. The Olympic Committee, they are looking at mandating potentially, I think now for Los Angeles because Paris is too late, that every athlete knows their sweat rate and sweat sodium. And if the IOC is doing that, it's only a matter of time before every single team is doing that. So there's also kind of a convergence of different factors, which I think is leading to like more federation level uniform kind of approaches to this is something we all need just to do to keep the athletes safe. Because it's only going to get more and more prevalent over time. Like I was speaking to someone the other day who basically was the person responsible for keeping the Premier League alive during COVID because they were the company that did all the COVID testing for the athletes. And he was like, who you really need to get in bed with are the academies because they have a safeguarding issue. They're legally responsible for the safety of the athletes because they're minors, right? So if you go after the safety issue, you get the young athletes who are the future athletes of our generation. And then it's like, it's a given that, in their head, they'll be like, how the heck were you not measuring hydration when you were an athlete? Like, what?
Yeah.
So it becomes a norm. And that is our thesis. Like, long story short, for any investors out there, right? Our thesis at FlowBio is hydration is going to become as synonymous as heart rate monitoring is today. Everyone's going to do it because one, if the tech is there, why not? And two, with the temperatures changing, et cetera, you kind of have to now. And that's really our bet. And that's why we want to own the category and we're doing what we're doing. Because we think it's going to be a category of massive relevance, and we want to be the people who are known for creating it and owning it.
Well, real-time heart rate for a lot of sports is kind of irrelevant. I mean, unless you're looking at very specific metrics, or you're looking at how often they hit their peak and you're trying to correlate that to total stress, but it doesn't factor in how they use their energy systems. So they might be hyper efficient at using that energy system that triggers when heart rate is incredibly high, which is most of the time sedation, right? They might be great at using that. Whereas they might not be so great at using ppCR, even though their muscles store it. Maybe they don't store that much for some reason. Maybe it's composition, right? Maybe it's activation. But, this piece I feel could apply to every single sport. I feel like there's possibly a missing link with anaerobic lactic athletes. There are a lot of sports that require both anaerobic and aerobic ability, right? And even in cycling, like there are periods where you have to sprint. Are they as frequent?
Yeah, you need fast twitch. Yeah, exactly. You need to respond to the race.
Yeah. So you need to have that anaerobic capacity there available at any given time when it's time for you to go. And kind of the same thing applies on the inverse side. Look, if your aerobic system as an anaerobic athlete isn't functioning properly, it's not recovering that anaerobic system effectively. So while your endurance athlete works in opposition, they're able to recover that anaerobic system that they don't use very fast because they are so aerobic. The other athlete, the anaerobic athlete, is if they're missing that aerobic piece, they're missing a lot of information, right? Data inside of the body that could be helping them to be better performers, But hey, look, if you don't maintain electrolyte balance, all that is essentially moot to begin with. If your blood viscosity changes, as you mentioned, you're going to have issues with glycogen and glucose. You're going to have issues with fat oxidation. You're going to have issues getting ATP PCR into localized areas. And even though it generates there, like it might need to move around just a little bit to go from one muscle to the next that's in a very local region of the body. It's important, I think, for all athletes to understand this. And hopefully, to your point, it expands. It expands to the point that everybody is doing it, that everybody does in monitoring this and trying to reach that peak. Because this could be, it's not a catalyst, it's a full stop point, right? If you aren't hydrated and you don't have balanced electrolytes, you are probably not going to perform for at least a prolonged period of time. That prolonged period of time is relevant to how you compete, right? But if your demand becomes higher in a singular competition and you have the fitness to do that, you've trained hard enough, that could be that stop point. I didn't consume enough electrolytes in the water that I consumed. I consumed enough water. I replaced what I lost, but I'm also a heavy sodium sweater and I lost that. And we're not even talking about magnesium, potassium, right? We're not even including that in.
And this is
in itself.
And we get asked this all of the time. I mean, technically it's possible, but we're just not doing it. And purely for the fact that you can't action that data. All electrolyte products are basically based off of sodium. Like sodium dictates the rest of the composition. So you can't end it yet, right? And this would be the cool thing. Wouldn't it be awesome in a world, and this is where we want to converge to, where you can individually dispense personalized electrolytes, right? Potassium, magnesium, sodium, calcium, as it pertains to what your body lost. So instead of having one tablet where everything is compressed and you do with what you're dealt with and you use sodium as the benchmark to dosage, you actually have an espresso style pod system where you have the individual electrolytes dispensed basically to your requirements. And you can imagine locker rooms, team buses, your at home kitchen, all of these, like a miniaturized equivalent of that. You can imagine that. You can imagine gyms even, where it's like it's an experience where you rock up and it knows from proximity, because your phone with Bluetooth or whatever, it knows that you're there and it gives you your bottle with your electrolytes, exactly what you need to recover from that session that you just did. And this is where you're like, I mean, we see it obviously, otherwise we wouldn't have built this company. But this is where sometimes when you speak to investors and they're like, I don't see the market for this. I'm like, then I'm sorry, because it's really, really not hard to see how personalized hydration is going to become an industry in itself, just like personalized vitamins are right now, right? Sure. You have those 3D printed stack gummies that Elo is doing. It's going to be a thing.
Ion, there's so many.
You name it, exactly. There's loads of doing that, and that's where we're moving. We're moving towards, because we can, right? The manufacturing capabilities that we've developed over time. We can personalize stuff that previously was just not economic to personalize. But obviously personalization is so much better because your body is very different to my body and what it needs is very different to what I need. And, you can't possibly sell us the same product and expect the same results.
I think we're a little bit gray as how are we actually measuring to calculate whether we should be consuming X, Y, or Z and in what quantities.
Exactly.
We have yet to see anybody sampling blood supply. Right.
I mean, what I would love, and I was speaking about this with an athlete who came into our lab yesterday, what I would love, I don't care about glucose levels. For like, as an athlete, unless you have a metabolic condition, I don't really care if my glucose goes up and down because, surprise, surprise, it's supposed to. And I have beef with glucose companies, personally speaking, selling essentially an experience which is saying you try and keep your glucose as flat as possible and like prevent spiking. Because you're telling essentially a population of people who are predisposed to eating disorders to not eat, to not spike their glucose. I mean, morally speaking, it's a horrendous, it's as bad as Instagram surfacing bikini photos to people who have body dysmorphia, right? Like it's horrible.
Down your body's ability to use glucagon and insulin. Because if you're
I mean it's really the science is just wrong selling glucose trackers to non-metabolic patients. It's just don't. I see some benefits once in a while, maybe, but it's not sufficient for the down sides to it, which is eating disorders, which is massively damaging. Like I'm still coming over an eating disorder 10 plus years later, right?
As a type 2 diabetic, right? There's a whole, I have arguments with my physician about.
Well, about where your glucose range should be. I mean, I have,
Well,
so in
here's
my
here's
family,
here's what it is. I have arguments about, understanding what spikes mean with them. You know what I mean?
You mean to them, right? Like,
to them, yes.
Yeah. So your spike, you might be in the gym, you might have a spike,
Right?
But that's going to trigger as an episode for you because you're type 2, right?
Right.
So
exactly.
If you were on a
start
pump,
going to the gym.
Yeah. So then what's the resolution? Because what they tell you is fitness can help to alleviate some of the diabetic symptoms, or at least prevent diabetes in the first place, right? We talk about this all the time.
Yeah.
Then what?
Go ahead.
Then what? In the moment, you're exercising and you get a spike, and they might say, oh, well, we don't want to see these spikes. Well, the spike occurred during exercise. It's a total normal function.
Or it's a total normal function when you eat something maybe not regular in your diet, but something unusual in your diet. That's not bad, necessarily bad.
Sure. But it's like, enjoy it. You know, it's one of those things. Like I've heard stories where people, they stopped eating like cookies or donuts or cake because obviously it's going to shoot your blood glucose up. Like, yeah, of course it is. Mm-hmm. But it's also quite yummy to have a slice of cake, and it's good for your mental health.
Here's my question, and what's always been my question on that, and I was just making that point, was why is it so important about, within reason, whether or not you get a spike, when the question for me has always been the response of my body to that spike. Do I come back down?
As long as it comes down. If it comes
down. You
down,
normalize naturally.
Yeah. Does it come back down over a 30-minute period? You can't expect it to go boom and then go straight back down. But over 30 minutes, is it coming back down? In most cases, yes. And here's my other thing.
Yeah, and I think the argument that the sport startups are taking is you want it to come down, you want to hack when it comes down, or you want to time that when it's coming down, you're not doing an effort or something, right? So I kind of understand their argument.
That also assumes that you know what fitness state they're in. And we're not even going to talk about zones. Zones are irrelevant.
Yeah.
We're talking about zones, people. What we're talking about is when you're using a specific energy system.
Yeah, if you're burning carbs. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Using all of them all the time. It's what is used predominantly based on what tissue composition are you, primarily, how fit are you, and how are you performing? What are you doing right now, specifically? Is it anaerobic? Is it aerobic? Does it require oxygen? Does it not require oxygen?
Yeah, there's a whole lot of this.
What predominantly?
Yeah, I mean now we're opening Pandora's box, because I think the thing to be at the end of the day, and just like, I guess to wrap it up, because we could rant about this all day, there's never going to be consensus. And this is something I learned coming into the space as a newcomer to sports science. There's never consensus on anything when it comes to sport nutrition. There's a very, very well-renowned nutritionist in Australia who says, be dehydrated. It's good. Who cares about fluid replacement and sodium replacement? Like, your body will figure it out. I'm paraphrasing grotesquely, obviously, but and there's a massive following of his doctrine. And in the meantime, you have other people who say you absolutely need to replace what you're losing, and quantifying these things matters. So I think that's just the thing with sports science. It's kind of, at the end of the day, you have to also just choose what you think is right for you and which doctrine you believe with, and just see how it works for you, right? Like, potentially, if someone's using the Super Sapiens, for example, and it works great for them, completely disregard what I have to say, right? Like, I think that at the end of the day is the summation. If it works for you, fantastic. Until, I guess, there's a research paper which says it shouldn't physically. But that's another story.
Well, hydration is to put a bow on some of our talk as we trail towards the unfortunate end of our hour. Hydration is directly related to the efficiency of all energy systems. You can't just, it's not tagged on one, it's not tagged on just certain episodes, but there is an individual component to it that I think is what you're measuring and what you're able to bring up with this new device. And
I'll just I'll end with one anecdote just to put it in perspective, because I had an athlete ask this yesterday at the lab, which is why it's top of mind. There's no good or bad when it comes to hydration. There's no good sweat rate or good fluid loss, or bad sweat rate or bad fluid loss, or bad sodium consumption. It's yours. It's your body's. It's what your body does to do what you ask it to do. And as long as you give it what it needs, don't worry if it's not an assessment of your fitness. It's not an assessment of how good you are as a human. It's just your body, how it's developed over the many years and what it's needing to lose in order to dissipate the heat that you're creating. And just to like completely put the cherry on the top, the Brownlee brothers, who we've been working with for quite a few years, they did a session which was led by their performance nutritionist. Same session, same conditions, basically genetically similar, right? They're both brothers. They are both elite athletes competing at the top of their game, following similar training intensities for their entire life because they basically became pros at similar times. They lost completely different amounts of fluid and sodium to each other, doing the exact same thing. Doesn't mean that Alistair or Johnny is better than the other. No, it's just what they needed to lose in order to do the work that they were asking their body to do to dissipate the heat that they were creating. So yeah.
I think in all aspects that's pretty. It's pretty normal. It's not good or bad when it comes to measuring things in your body like glucose and sweat and other functions. It's yours. It's not
exactly.
It's not whether or not it's right or wrong. What
we will never do is we're never going to do a social graph of where you plot, the bell curve, because it doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. For those over optimizers out there, you can sleep at night. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You cannot optimize this.
Yes, you cannot match someone else and be just as good as them. It's not a performance.
Exactly.
Hey, so we do YouTube. Can you run and grab it so that people can see it?
Yeah. Let me. Now you'll get a bit of a tour. Well, if I'm doing the tour of the house, I'm going to have to give you the tour of my real pride and joy, just because every cyclist has to. But that's my baby resting from a hard morning's work. I don't know if you can see it, but yeah, that's my cervelo.
There it is.
But yeah, let me grab it. Sorry, it's actually in the same room I just came from. Here we go. Just have this, sneaky plug for cervelo. Phil White will be happy. So here you go. This is it. So this is, as I mentioned, I use the Wahoo ticker. So this is my chest strap.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a plug for core. That's my core body temperature sensor. And then that's the S1. So you basically have, it attaches to the side where you can then adhere to the skin. So this is the skin side. And basically what you see is a sweat inlet there, skin temperature sensor here, and you got your USB-C charger there. And then this is your on button. So basically if I want to start a session, I just hold it in for 3 seconds, and then the LED blinks 3 times, and now it's going to blink twice to say that it's in session. And that's basically it. Now, anytime I start sweating, it's going to be recording data. And then when I come home, I just stop session, and then I sync it with my phone, and then I get my data. And
how many hours or how many sessions could you get in with one charge?
200 hours per charge. So for the typical 3 months of training.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's not bad.
Small, really for the most part. I mean,
no. I mean, it's
especially for the aerobic
simple to use. Yeah,
but even for the anaerobic athlete, it's probably not going to be encumbering in any way under.
Oh, it's non-noticeable. I mean, once this is on, right? This is on my back, so it basically resides like somewhere here, just kind of slightly offset from my spine. You don't notice it. Once it's there, it's you don't care.
And
about
you said you can wear it anywhere.
Yeah, so you can wear it on your bicep. You can wear it on your your quads, your calf if you want to. I mean, we right now support your arm, your wrist, and your chest and your back. But yeah, depending on the sport, obviously, the more sports we go into, we're going to have to be compatible with different sites. If it's contact sport, for example, you probably can't have it on your bicep, but you could probably have it on your thigh underneath, like your boxers or whatever.
Yeah. Well, even
so
small
there's all these
work pretty well because it might be protected by some sort of padding and potentially locked down by either compression garments or even your equipment, which I'm sure is also helpful to keep it from moving, right? So that you're not having any stray in data there from the object kind of moving around or losing.
I mean, they figure out a way to wear microphones and other wearables. So I'm sure there's a way to put this on in contact sports to protect it and get the data you need. So
and then worst case, we just create a rugged punch-proof version. But yeah. So right now, today, if you're a cyclist, a runner, or a triathlete, you can use it. So you can go over to the website Flowbio and buy one. Other sports we're basically in pilot phase with a couple of disciplines because essentially, and this is like a bit of the science, but the way that we get the accuracy that we do is similar to like what you're familiar with when your Apple Watch or your Garmin. Whenever you do a different exercise type, you have to physically select the different exercise. It's the same for us, and the reason for that is there's a different algorithm for every discipline. that influences your fluid and sodium losses. So we need to develop every single discipline's equivalent algorithm, which just takes time.
Yeah.
So we're trying to assess which one's next, but it's realistically going to be like soccer/football here in Europe, which is quite similar to American football in terms of like the nature of the sport, right? Stop-start intensity, high bursts of energy, followed by like walking around, rest periods. So realistically, American football, as you mentioned, I don't be surprised if next year they might be wearing it at the Super Bowl.
Well, listen, it's been unfortunately I have to stop us right now. But it's been great having you on, and I'm sure there's another 5 or 6 hours we could have this discussion with.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah,
I'm literally I kept writing down questions, and I said there's no way I can answer. I can ask all of these. However, I think I got them all in the bundle, so to speak. Everything. But it's been great having you on. I don't have any additional questions. Chris, do you have any?
No, it's been great having you on, Stefan. Really good content, very rich, very knowledgeable. It sounds like you have a phenomenal product that is market ready. And I think if you're an athlete, I think you should be interested in it. I think you should spend a little bit of dough to know.
Well, this is right down our listeners and our audience's alley. So I'm sure that this is. I don't say this a lot because I think all of our shows are good. But I think this one will be a really one that gets a lot of questions for us, and hopefully, you'll
maybe
come
we
back
do a follow up. We can do an
hopefully
AMA.
You'll come back and answer some of those for us.
Well, I think with the AMA, we'll actually have the smart people from FlowBio join, which is our head of R&D and head of physiology. I'm just I'm the face without the substance. They have the substance.
Well, you brought plenty of substance today, and we appreciate you, Chris.
This has been Performance Talk with Yul Gordon and Chris Costa, today's guest, Stefan Van Der Fluit. We'll see you again real soon, guys.
Cheers, guys.